What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to my Bloomburrow set review. This time we are going through the blue cards. I have a video up for all 5 colors that will be coming out this week, with red including colorless and lands. So if you're interested in that, check it out. And if you like this sort of content, leave a like on this video and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content I'm making on the regular. Alright, starting off we have Azure Beastbinder, 2-mana 1/3 red rogue with vigilance. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or greater. Whenever it attacks, up to 1 target artifact, creature, or planeswalker an opponent controls loses all abilities until your next turn. If it's a creature, it also has base power and toughness 2/2 until your next turn. So Azure Beastbinder only requires attacking to get this trigger, and I think it's a pretty great option to permanently shut down whatever the most powerful thing is on the board, which has activated or triggered abilities or any sort of static ability that's going to be really messing you up, specifically like Eldrazi Annihilators, things like that. And because it is very evasive, it also fits into rogue decks, I think, pretty well. So some comparables would be like Mass Diminish or Mercurial Transformation. Specifically, Mass Diminish says until your next turn. Mercurial Transformation is only until the end of the current turn. So Azure Beastbinder is actually only the second example we've had of this where it lasts until your next turn. So if assuming that this stays on the board, we can keep attacking, and just always neutralize whatever the most potent threat is on the board. So I think that this is actually a really interesting pick in Commander, and I think it definitely fits into like your rogue decks, so like your Kami's Obscura Oculus type of decks or Anawan the Ruin Rogue type of decks. And because it is evasive, it may make the cut in a Yuriko deck, although I think that Yuriko really wants to play a 1-drop that is evasive, so it's a little bit awkward with Yuriko's curve. But the fact that you have removal essentially stapled to this evasive body, I think is just fantastic, and definitely playable in Commander decks that want small evasive bodies. Alright, and now we move on to Dour Port-Mage, 2-mana 1/3 frog wizard. Whenever one or more other creatures you control leave the battlefield without dying, draw a card, and we can pay 2 and tap it to return another target creature you control to its owner's hand. So in Bloomburrow, frogs have this commonality where they want to be bouncing creatures and playing creatures. So I think that this is really a slot in for your blink decks only, and I included Morphon here as a nod to the frog tribal decks. We don't have any particularly strong frog commanders that care about blinking at the moment, but what this essentially does is it turns all of your flicker spells into cantrips. So I think that is pretty good. I don't know if it makes the cut in a Brago deck, because Brago just really has kind of this concrete game plan already where you want to be playing your creatures, and I mean a lot of your card draw is stapled to enter the battlefield's effects already. I think that I would be curious with experimenting with Brago, because I think just the fact that you are essentially now drawing an extra card every turn for only 2 mana, I think is pretty interesting and definitely worth consideration in Flicker decks. And of course, if you care about bouncing frogs back and forth, definitely slot it into your frog tribal decks. Then we'll move to Eluge, or Eluge, I'm not really sure how this is pronounced. I'm going to go with Eluge, the Shoreless Sea. 4-mana star elemental fish, legendary creature. Power and toughness, each equal to the number of islands you control. Whenever Eluge enters or attacks, put a flood counter on target land. It's an island in addition to its other types, for as long as it has a flood counter on it. So Eluge can leave the battlefield, it'll still have those flood counters. And most importantly, it says the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs blue or 1 colorless less to cast for each land you control with a flood counter on it. So I think that this probably doesn't really fit into many existing decks. I think this is an interesting Commander build around, because you can be discounting a lot of your instants and sorceries the more that you flicker this and the more that it attacks, and it does have a big body to be able to trigger its attack trigger multiple times to survive combat. So some comparables here, so like Aquatek's Will we've already seen as a 1 mana, essentially just puts a flood counter on something, and it's notable too that it is an island in addition to its other types. So if you want to be putting this on opponents' lands, you can't brick their lands by turning them into islands. So that is also worth noting. But one of the existing commanders we've seen is Zolotoyak, the Smiling Flood, which also cares about flood counters, and the payoff for this one is that you untap each permanent you control with a counter on it. So not necessarily just caring about flood counters, pretty much anything that has flood or any counter on there. So Eluge, I think, is interesting. I was looking at some of the different types of decks that are using Eluge as the commander on EDH, right? There's only like 176 decks posted out there so far, and a lot of them seem to be big mana decks. So mass manipulation, you know, you're discounting all of those blue pips and colorless costs. Time stretch, you know, these big rampy type of blue spells that are sort of like good stuff. And you know, you have your general blue good stuffs like a Sublime Epiphany or Flow of Ideas, where Flow of Ideas specifically cares about the number of islands you control. I don't know that I would necessarily build this as a big mana deck. I think this is actually better built as a Voltron commander, specifically if you have anything that can give it evasion and double strike. A lot of blue spells that are instants and sorceries give evasion, and then if you have any sort of equipment that can be attached to Eluge to give it double strike, I think you have a better odds of one-shotting players via Voltron commander damage. It just takes a lot of work to build up those flood counters. Now, and I was looking, so specifically if you put a flood counter on a target land, it only cares about each land with flood counters on them, so you can't be really proliferating these because it doesn't matter how many flood counters each land has, it's each land. So you need to be putting a lot of flood counters on stuff, and I feel like if you are dedicating slots in your deck to actually putting flood counters on things, that's just not quite powerful enough, I think, to be viable in 2024 Commander. So the way that I would build this is actually probably Voltron, where you're doing like double strike shenanigans, but you're giving a lot of evasion, and you are using your protection with your instants and sorcery spell slots instead of these sort of big mana spells. So kind of a weird commander, but definitely interesting. This is something we haven't yet seen, and so props to Wizard for making a very interesting build around commander. Next up, we have Kitsa Otterball Elite, 2-mana 1/3 Otter Wizard with Vigilance and Prowess. We can tap it to draw a card, then discard a card, so essentially it's just a Merfolk Looter, and then we can pay 2 and tap it to copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy, activate only if Kitsa's power is 3 or greater. So this is the 2024 Power Crept version of Merfolk Looter. Merfolk Looter, of course, being the 2-mana 1/1 you can just tap, draw, and discard a card. We've seen Rona Herald of Invasion have a lot of success in Standard, which allows for potential multiple looting effects by whenever we cast a legendary spell, you untap it, so you can tap it again. I think this is just a solid pick for any deck that wants to be looting, drawing cards and discarding cards, any sort of madness or draw matters types of decks. And it has a Vigilance and Prowess, so the Vigilance allows you to get through combat, and then you can tap it in your second main phase to get the looting effect. And of course, Prowess has some synergy with Spellslinger decks, but I don't think that this necessarily goes into Spellslinger decks because it doesn't do enough for what Spellslinger decks want to be doing. I think the Prowess is more a nod to standard Otter builds. So in the standard format, Otters care more about the Spellslinging aspect. I don't think this would really make the cut in a Spellslinger commander deck in 2024, but I will certainly be including it in my Inala Wizard Tribal deck. I think Wizard Tribal wants this a lot. My build specifically for Inala is a Reanimator build, in addition to like Arami types of decks that want to be reanimating things. So really, Kitsa, anything that wants to be putting stuff in the graveyard, or if you care about the Otter or Wizard creature type, I think this is a slam dunk. Next, we have Portent of Calamity. X in a blue sorcery. Reveal the top X cards of your library. For each card type, you may exile a card of that type from among them. Put the rest into your graveyard. You may cast a spell from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost if you exiled 4 or more cards this way. Then put the rest of the exiled cards into your hand. So this is essentially like a mini Aminatu's Augury combined with like a Fact or Fiction type of graveyard filling effect. So if we consider the case that we are paying 4 into X, so it's going to be a 5-cost sorcery, we're going to reveal the top 4 cards, and assuming we have our deck built correctly around this card for each card type, you may exile a card of that type from among them. So let's assume we're probably going to hit a land, And then if we assume that we hit 3 other cards that are not matching card types, so we exile 3 cards. If we have others, though, those can go into our graveyard. So a little bit of self-mill synergy going on here, but not necessarily, depending on how much we put into X. So assume that we have our 1 land, and then we hit our 3 other spells. You may cast a spell from among the exile cards. So of the 3 cards that you flip, you can cast one for free, and then you put the rest into your hand. So it would essentially be a draw 3, cast 1 for free for 5 mana, which I think is a solid case. So I think that this is interesting. You definitely want to be playing a giant bomb off of that free cast for this to be worth it, I think, because I wouldn't play this for the self-mill type of effect, because I don't think you can mill enough for it to be worth it to fill your graveyard, because you're going to be exiling a lot of these cards. Now, actually, let's consider the other case, right? Let's flip this on its head. What if we're running like in an Animar deck, right? Only creatures. So we would reveal 4, then we would exile 1 creature, so we could cast one of those creatures for free, and then we also we would fill our graveyard with the other 3. Right, and okay, so let's back this up. So assuming we exile 3 creatures and 1 land, just given the sort of proportions of card types. So we draw a land, we cast a creature for free, and then we put 2 into our graveyard. So if we care about creatures entering the graveyard, I think that this is actually playable in self-mill. It has to be kind of a specific setup. I just think that this would fit really well more in those decks that want to make specific use of the cast for free clause. So Ula-like Fused Atrocity is what immediately came to mind. Now imagine this magical Christmas land. All right, you have Ula-like on the field. You cast Portent of Calamity, right, for 5 mana, so X is equal to 4. You cast for free without paying an Eldrazi spell, right? And then because you cast it for free, you would need 2 more mana up to then copy it with Ula-like Fused Atrocity. So you could potentially get like 2 Ulamogs or 2 Kozileks for a total of 7 mana with these spells. And I think that's just pretty insane. Eldrazi already want to be ramping a lot, and so I don't think it's that big of an ask to, be able to pay 5 and then copy it with 2 more to have 7 total. So that is an interesting use case, and I think certainly worth it, certainly potent. And then the other commander I thought of is just any commander that cares about having an even distribution of card types, so like Atraxa Grand Unifier, for example, would maybe want this. It depends on if you can find the bombs to cast in your Atraxa deck. If you tend to build it with or towards the higher end of the mana curve, I think that this is definitely playable. But what an interesting card. I mean, I think, again, props to Wizard for having interesting designs in the set. I think that Portent of Calamity is interesting and would definitely make it in specific decks. Next, we have Season of Weaving, the blue version of the season cycle. 6 mana, sorcery, choose up to 5 widgets worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. We can pay 1, draw a card, pay 2, choose an artifact or creature you can create a token that's a copy of it, or pay 3, return each non-land, non-token permanent to its owner's hand. So I was thinking of comparables here. So like the second mode would be like a Phyrexian Metamorph. You can copy an artifact or creature, and then if we did that, we would then choose to draw 3 cards. So essentially 6 mana would be like Phyrexian Metamorph plus draw 3. So in that way, I guess if Phyrexian Metamorph costs 3 and then your draw 3 for 3 mana spell combined together into 1 card, I guess that does add up to 6 mana, so that's definitely playable. And then if we want to, we can use the board wipe option, which comparable here is kind of filter out. The key difference being that Season of Weaving says non-token permanent instead of non-land permanent, so you can really abuse that clause in like Marnie's Calgar decks or Sakashima clone decks, where you're creating token copies or any sort of tokens on the battlefield to essentially have a one-sided board wipe, and then you would be able to either create another copy if you choose mode number 3, or you could draw 2 cards. So that sort of depends on however you want to do it. I think, and honestly, if you wanted to fit this into just a big card draw deck, you could just use this as a 6 mana draw 5 spell, although I don't think that's really getting the most mileage out of this card. I think actually the board wipe mode is probably the most potent, combined with creating a copy of something absolutely massive. So interesting build. I will definitely be slotting this into my Sakashima clones deck just because it does so much. I mean, we can create 2 token copies of something. So I think that's very interesting. And then draw a card on top of that. I mean, that would be absolutely ludicrous. Like if you have like a token copy of a Galta or something, right? You create 2 additional. Oh wait, no. Well, that wouldn't work because they're legendary. Let's say like an old Gnawbone, right? You create 2 copies of old Gnawbones and then draw a card on top of that for 6 mana. That is absolutely ludicrous, possibly up to 15 mana worth of effects there. So this is definitely a potent blue card, and I think it definitely upholds the reputation of the seasons being very, very good in Commander. So I think that this is a very potent slot into most blue decks as well. Next, we have Valley Floodcaller, 3 mana, 2/2 Otter Wizard with Flash. You may cast non-creature spells as though they had Flash. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, birds, frogs, otters, and rats you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Untap them. So this goes into any, I think, tribal deck, specifically birds or otters. You need to care about the untap ability. It is kind of a ley line of anticipation, but we have seen, I think there's another card for spirits that you can cast stuff on your opponent's end steps specifically. But I think you definitely have to care about the tribal aspect here. If you only care about the flash component, you're not getting as much mileage out of this as you possibly could. And I was thinking like, okay, well, so like Inga and Asuka also want to be casting creature spells. They want to be untapping things. And so you might be able to use this more of in a big ramp deck that wants to be tapping a lot of creatures and then untapping them for mana. Alternatively, you could slot this into draw-go decks, although I just don't know if you care about this enough. I mean, you have to care about the non-creature class specifically, so you maybe not as many creatures in your deck, so it just sort of depends. It's kind of an awkward card here, if I'm being honest. I think you would have to really care about instants and sorceries on your opponent's turns, so maybe like, I think there's like a fairy commander that also cared about casting things on your opponent's turns. So an interesting card here in Valley Floodcaller. This fits in some niche decks, I would say. Next, we have Pollywog Prodigy, 2 mana 1/3 frog wizard with evolve, which means whenever a creature you control enters, if that creature has greater power or toughness than this creature, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell with mana value less than Pollywog Prodigy's power, draw a card. I think this card has the potential to be a staple in most blue decks. I think you have to really be able to either trigger the evolve ability consistently or pump it in some way. So if we look at comparables, so like Esper Sentinel is just a staple of the format at only 1 mana, but it always triggers, and something like a Mystic Remora, another staple, again only 1 mana, which triggers on each non-creature spells. I think that if you can proliferate the 1/1 counters, Pollywog Prodigy will definitely be a slam-in. So any sort of like Atraxa +1/+1 counters decks, and even dare I say an Animar deck would want this, because as you are spamming creatures out onto the field that have power greater than 1, you can be pumping this quite a bit. Now the key here, the key downside with this card is that it says whenever opponent casts a non-creature spell with mana value less than Pollywog Prodigy's power, draw a card. So it starts out as 0. So, you know, might even be playable in CEDH with a lot of the 0 mana spells being cast, like Mana Crypt, etc., or the Moxes or things like that. But you need to at least, I think, 2 evolve triggers for this to start being really, really good. So anything where you can either proliferate the 1/1 counters once, so first you would have to trigger it, then proliferate it, or if you can spam out 2 creatures really quick on your next turn to pump it up a little bit, I think that Pollywog Prodigy is an absolute slam dunk, and I think that this will draw a lot of cards. Next, we go through some honorable mentions. So these are cards that are playable in Commander, but not not quite recommendations for most blue decks. These are a little bit more niche. So now we have Pearl of Wisdom, 3-mana sorcery. The spell costs 1 less to cast if you control an otter. Draw 2. So it's just a nice draw 2 for 2. And you guys know I am a big fan of draw 2 for 2 type of cards. We've already seen this with cards like Winged Words, which cares about flying creatures. So 2-mana draw 2s, play more of them in your decks, folks. Next we have Shoreline Looter, 2-mana 1/1 rat rogue. It can't be blocked. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, then discard a card unless 7 or more cards in your graveyard. So this cares specifically about getting through because it is evasive and drawing cards. Now you can also possibly care about the discard if you actually want the discard. That might be a potential upside. When I was looking at this, I actually was thinking of it as a downside, but there could be some upside if you want to put cards into your graveyard. But I was thinking this is pretty much a slam dunk in rogue type of decks that want to be filling graveyards. So Anawan the Ruined Thief is kind of the poster boy for that among rogue tribal decks. Next we have Spellgyre, 4-mana instant, choose 1, counter target spell, or surveil 2, then draw 2 cards. So this is an interesting pick for any sort of draw-go type of control decks. We've seen this before with Archmage's Charm, which is a little bit more pip intensive, but it's 1 less mana. And there's also another card that I think it's Spellweave or something like that. I'll have to put it up on the screen in post-editing. But this is just an interesting option if you want to either be holding up your mana to counter the next threat or to be cashing that in for some card draw, both things that control want a lot. So if you want the essentially second best version of Archmage's Charm in your deck, I would heavily consider Spellgyre. 4 mana is a lot to keep up. I'm not gonna lie, that is a lot to keep up in 2024 Commander, but we just don't have that many effects where we can choose one between countering a spell or drawing cards. So there's really sort of 3 playable effects, Archmage's Charm being the best, and then I think now Spellgyre takes the second place. So if you like Archmage's Charm, give Spellgyre a look if you want a second copy. Then we have Splash Portal, 1-mana sorcery, exile target creature you control, then return to the battlefield under its owner's control. If that creature is a bird, frog, otter, or rat, draw a card. So this is mono blue does not have many options for 1-mana blink effects. The only other option that I really saw was Essence Flux, which is better, of course, because it's an instant. The sorcery part really neuters this card. Of course, if you're in a tribal deck that cares about bouncing things, so maybe Frog Tribal wants this, you could certainly play it to get that extra card draw. But I just wanted to mention this because it is the second option we've gotten for 1-mana blink spells in blue. If you're in white, you're already going to be playing a lot more of those instants, the ephemerate type of effects. But yeah, if you're not in white and you're looking for 1-mana bounce spells, this is an option for you. Next, we have 20-Toed Toad, 4-mana, 3/3, Frog Wizard. Your maximum hand size is 20. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, put a 1/1 counter on it and draw a card. And whenever 20-Toed Toad attacks, you win the game if there are 20 or more counters on it, or you have 20 or more cards in hand. So what an interesting alternative win con for this particular card. I think that the easier of the 2 modes between the counters and card draw is probably the card draw. We've already seen ridiculous commanders that just want to power out as much card draw as humanly possible. You know, I think like even Peer into the Abyss would be a viable option if you're in like Dimir colors. But 20-Toed Toad, definitely interesting. I'm not personally not a fan of alternative win cons that have just you win the game stapled on it, because often they can be a lot easier to trigger than the designers intended. But definitely the card draw mode is easier than the 1/1 counter mode, unless you were to just stack all of your 1/1 counter resources into this card. Now, notably, it does have to attack, so your opponents are going to see this coming a mile away. But it is certainly a card that you can build around to trigger that win the game clause. And with that, we have Lilypad Village, 1 land in blue colors, so we can, it enters untapped, we can tap to add a colorless or a blue, but the blue has to be cast on a creature spell. We can pay it 1 and tap to reveal 2, activate only if a bird, frog, otter, or rat enter the battlefield under your control this turn. I think that this is only really playable in any sort of tribal deck, so your frog, tribal decks, etc. And I would say only really in 2 colors, because again, in 3 colors, we really want to be making as much mana pips as we can. And this is, you know, obviously cares about creatures and specifically those tribal bird, frogs, otters, and rats. So I would say only if you're in a 2-color frog, bird, otter, or rat deck, really, I think this fits in. But beyond that, I don't think that this is really playable. And finally, that concludes our card set review, but I did want to go over the top 3 blue cards that I think are the most powerful out of Bloomburrow and Bloomburrow Commander, and that is, with drumroll please, Azure Beastbinder, Season of Weaving, and Pollywog Prodigy. Azure Beastbinder, I think, is just so potent in permanently taking the most powerful effect off of the board. That is absolutely great. Season of Weaving is so modal. You can really just abuse this card, especially with the non-token clause, if you are built around spamming out tokens on the field or any sort of clone tokens. And if you don't care about any of that, you use it as a 6-mana draw 5, which we have not seen before. We've seen other types of cards that care about like your highest converted mana cost or your number of islands you control, but Season of Weaving explicitly says just 6 mana, draw 5, and so if you care about that, that's playable as well. And then Pollywog Prodigy, I think, is just going to, if you consistently trigger the evolve clause, I think that this will draw a ton of cards over the course of a game and might give Rhystic Study a run for its money. I mean, not really. I mean, Rhystic Study is just in a whole nother league on its own, but you know, it might be Blue's version of Esper Sentinel, or might even edge out Fairy Mastermind in certain decks that want to be drawing cards that is attached to a creature body. So with that, that brings us to the end of our mono blue set review for Bloomburrow. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I had a ton of fun at putting it together. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like on it. It helps me with the algorithm and gain all of that exposure and type of stuff. And subscribe if you like more Magic content. I'll be releasing I still have the red, green, and black videos to make, and red, of course, will include the colorless and lands portion of Bloomburrow, so stay tuned for all of the best cards from Bloomburrow and Bloomburrow Commander. With that, my name is Nathan. You've been watching Spellgyre Productions YouTube channel, and hopefully we'll see you all in the next one.